Hi there, and welcome to part two of the school transportation presentation this week. Thank you, James, for taking us over the big ideas of funding, regulations, and data collection related to school transportation. To jump off from there and to prime you for further reading and consideration, I wanted to look at complications that exist or are emerging that might impact transportation. I'm M. Scott Tatum, and I'll be covering four possible complications that impact school transportation and the way we fund and regulate it. This will include safety, charter and open enrollment policies, school start times, and of course, the COVID pandemic response. Let's get on with it. School bus transportation is considered to be the safest possible way for students to get to school. While currently only about 33% of students ride school buses to campus, that represents over 25 million students traveling a combined total of nearly 6 billion miles per year. A student is over 70 times more likely to arrive safe to campus on a school bus than any other mode of transportation, such as a parent vehicle, walking or riding a bike, or public mass transportation. But even then, there are safety concerns to be considered. Nearly 80,000 vehicles illegally pass a stopped school bus daily. Students boarding or unboarding a bus can be at risk for accidents, and there are incidents each year on the bus that result in the loss of life. And of course, special education and 504 students can have required and applicable accommodations during transportation, including mobility assistance device, special attention to medical conditions, and behavioral needs that all impact safety. While in response to these concerns over the years, most states have required traffic to pay deference to school buses in transit, only about half the states have created a policy allowing for video recording and ticketing of violators. Even with such a small number of safety incidents or deaths while riding the school bus, 8 states have begun to require seatbelts to be installed and worn during transit. And most states require additional monitors or specially equipped school buses for students with unique needs. When considering these existing challenges and responses, I encourage you to reflect on some questions related to each. Number one, what are the costs, both financial and societal, to having cameras installed on the stop arm of the bus? How much does it cost to retrofit the buses with seatbelts? And who enforces that when most buses have only one adult, the school bus driver, and they're a little busy? Number two, some states, such as Texas, rescinded authorizations for school districts and law enforcement agencies to use stop arm cameras. What were the various reasons that might have led to this? And number three, what are some other safety considerations you can imagine that impact or are impacted by school bus transportation? With school choice, a major conversation in this class and in some of the others we're all a part of, it is worthwhile for us to consider how school transportation may or may not be impacted by this paradigm shift. In most recent federal education policy reform efforts, there is language that authorizes versions of an inter- or intra-district transfer away from schools and districts that are not meeting standards. In doing so, they create possible challenges for transportation when they create situations where students need to travel greater distances to attend their school. This is also true for charter schools and even public schools of choice, like magnet schools, that fight against segregated housing patterns to help reduce racial isolation. Surprisingly, this is rarely a fully addressed set of complications. With open enrollment, 12 states don't speak to transportation at all. 17 require parents to figure out that burden if they choose to go to another public school. And the rest of the states are split evenly over requiring the receiving district to help figure out school bus transportation, or if the sending district should cover that cost, compounding a likely already difficult situation. With charter schools, 29 of the 45 states simply do not specify whether a charter has to figure out transportation for its students. Some will provide funding to the charters if they do, however. In 16 of the states, some of the tie their public funding to providing transportation, just like any other public school, while the other half requires a larger public school district to service charter schools in their area as well. With such variations and requirements for transportation in the school choice world, how does this potential cost or savings change the incentives for school reform and the public school or charter environment? Number two, why is it fair that charter schools often get to skip the expense of transportation? And number three, what is the state interest in transportation in helping address segregation? Perhaps not on the short list of most people when considering impacts to school transportation, there is a movement beginning to emerge at the state level to address school start times. Proponents of changing school start times look at research showing adolescents simply do not get enough sleep to be optimal for learning or health. Even though school district start times are typically regulated at the local level, the ever expanding state and federal regulation system of local education agencies is beginning to look at the many variables in optimizing learning. School start times, as any family with a kid who misses the bus one morning would know, impacts a lot of realms, including after school activities, childcare, traffic patterns, availability for work, and the availability of transportation due to such scheduling. The current start time in the United States for all school is 8:03 a.m. Is that too early, too late? What do y'all have in your area? In response to some of these challenges and conditions, California became the first state to mandate school start times. It and other states who have studied or attempted similar regulation typically specify starting elementary no earlier than 8 a.m. and secondary schools no earlier than 8:30 a.m. Much of the proposed and passed legislation over the last few years also limits the amount of time in transit on a school bus. The many study groups that have been created typically agree with all of these conditions, but typically list the numerous impediments to changing the status quo as a reason to stick with it, including transportation. If your district or state had this conversation in the future, why is transportation the reason often cited as a reason not to change the start times? And you know what? If it were to be implemented, what are some of the possible ways, impacts to school bus transportation that would need to be addressed to make it happen? Finally, as we work through this continued COVID-19 pandemic and consider possible other interruptions to the old status quo of school bus transportation, let's consider some of the constraints. A typical school bus can carry around 66 to 90 students, depending on the age and size of the children. The CDC suggestions at the start of the 2020 school year suggested only one student per seat, with every other seat occupied, in addition to masks and sanitation. If you think about the 2 or 3 students in a typical seat, reducing the ridership of these school buses by roughly 20%, to roughly 20% of normal, is a pretty significant change. There are not enough buses in the fleet or even on the production lines to accommodate the additional need if all students were to return to school and use transportation this year. And even in a good year, it's tough to find enough commercially licensed drivers. With hybrid schedules, offset schedules, and other operational changes to allow for a COVID response campus, routing becomes much, much more complicated. And on top of that, federal requirements for special transportation were never waived. The alternatives to school bus transportation are also inherently inequitable, as private transport is a resource-intensive expenditure for many low-income families. In response, many districts, mine included, looked at ways to soften the CDC guidelines for buses, leaning more heavily on contact sanitation and symptom monitoring over the distance guidelines found in the guidance. Quickly, most districts had to create expansive data collection systems to determine who is going to go back to campus and which of these students need transportation. This resulted in many areas with decreased ridership, though of course not equitably so. In response to decreased ridership, combined routes made for extended time and fewer hired drivers, which, as the year rolled on and families returned back to campuses, created even more crowded buses. Its impact to school start times and stop times, driving riders into earlier pickups and later drop-offs, can't be overstated. With some buses not being used at all in some districts that remain mostly remote, those districts look to use school buses in some innovative ways, potentially as ways to do food delivery services to students at home, and of course, Wi-Fi hotspot broadcast locations. In such a dynamic situation, what do you think the total financial impact of transportation services was during the pandemic? And who's going to pick up that tab? With ethical questions in front of us, even in bus transportation policy, should we prioritize physical health and safety over access to the physical campus? And why were buses in such a situation where they were so dramatically impacted by the pandemic in the first place? What was working and not working in public school transportation? That's a lot to think about. As James alluded to earlier, one of the challenges is in looking at the regulations, funding, and data is that the school systems are likely pretty late to the game in using deep data analysis to drive innovation in school bus transportation systems. This year's pandemic, as well as other existing and emerging challenges facing school bus transportation in the United States, prompt us to look at what's next. The readings we suggest for this week give you an existing look at how transportation is funded in the 50 states. The other reading prompts you to consider how making changes to the system with data crunching and leaning into innovative technologies found in the larger transportation sector might help solve some of the challenges facing the big yellow school bus. But now it's over to you. Head over to Blackboard discussion posts for this week to let us know what other questions, reflections, thoughts you have about school transportation. Thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to reading the discussion board. If you need me for anything else, you are always welcome to reach out. I hope you have a great day.